So we have read a book by Roald Dahl, a great book, The Witches. We've read a book by the author Kate DiCamillo, who wrote The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. And then now we are going to be meeting another author. Her name is Lynn Reid Banks. She's another author from England, and she wrote the Indian in the Cupboard series. Now, some of you may say, well, I already saw the movie. Well, guess what? There's so much more than the movie, because this is a series of 5 books. It starts with the Indian in the Cupboard, and then it goes to several other books that we will be reading as well. She's a great author. If you loved Roald Dahl, there's lots of books that Roald Dahl has written. If you loved Kate DiCamillo, lots of books that she has written. And if you end up loving Lynn Reid Banks, she's written many other books besides the books in this series. So this is the Indian in the Cupboard. And it was not that Omri didn't appreciate Patrick's birthday present. So the boy, the main character in the story's name is Omri. O-M-R-I. Think about that. O-M-R-I. Not a name that we are used to, but it's Omri. It's not that he didn't appreciate Patrick's birthday present, far from it. He was really very grateful, sort of. It was, without a doubt, very kind of Patrick to give Omri anything at all, let alone a secondhand plastic Indian that he himself had finished with. So it's kind of like you would go through your old toys, and then you might give a friend one of your old toys. So he thinks it's nice that he gave it to him for his birthday, but not that great. The trouble was, though, that Omri was getting a little fed up with small plastic figures, of which he had loads. Biscuit tins full, probably 3 or 4 if they were put all away at the same time, which they never were, because most of the time they were scattered about in the bedroom, the bathroom, the loft, the kitchen, the breakfast room, not to mention Omri's bedroom and garden. The compost heap was full of soldiers, which over several autumns had been raked up with the leaves by Omri's mother, who was rather careless about such things. And Omri and Patrick had spent many hours together playing with their joint collections of plastic toys. But now they'd had just about enough of them, at least for the moment, and that was why when Patrick brought his present to school on Omri's birthday, Omri was disappointed. He tried not to show it, but he was. "Do you really like him?" said Patrick, as Omri stood silently with the Indian in his hand. "Yeah, he's fantastic," said Omri, in kind of a slightly flattish voice. "I haven't got an Indian." "I know. I haven't got any cowboys either." "Nor have I. That's why I couldn't play anything with him." Omri was about to say, "I won't be able to either," but he didn't want to hurt Patrick's feelings, so he said nothing. He put the Indian in his pocket, and he forgot about it. After school, there was a family tea. That's kind of in England where they all take a break in the afternoon and they have tea and a little dessert, and they all take a break in their family and hang out for a while. And all the excitement of the presents from his parents and his 2 older brothers, he got his dearest wish, a skateboard complete with kickboard and Kryptonic wheels from his mum and dad. So mum, instead of mom, like a lot of us say, or mother, it's M-U-M, mum. That's what they call moms in England a lot of times. And from his eldest brother, Adiel, a helmet. Gillen, his other brother, hadn't bought him anything because he had no money. His pocket money had been stopped some time ago in connection with a very unfortunate accident involving their father's bicycle. So when Gillen's turn came to give Omri a present, Omri was very surprised when a large package was put in front of him, kind of untidily wrapped in brown paper and string. "What is it?" "Have a look at it. I found it in the alley." The alley was a narrow passage that ran along the bottom of the garden where the dustbins stood, and the 3 boys used to play there sometimes. And occasionally they found treasures that other, perhaps richer neighbors had thrown away. So Omri was quite excited as he tore off the paper. So think about this. It's his birthday. His friend gave him an old toy that he didn't want to play with. And his brother found a toy in someone else's garbage. Inside was a small white metal cupboard with a mirror on the door, the kind you see over a basin in old-fashioned bathrooms. So have you ever seen that before? So you might walk into some people's bathrooms and there's a mirror on the wall, but you can open up the door and there's shelves inside. It's called a medicine cupboard. You might suppose Omri would get disappointed again because of this, because the cupboard was fairly plain and, except for a shelf, completely empty, but oddly enough, he was very pleased with it. He loved cupboards of any sort because of the fun of keeping things in them. He was not a very tidy boy in general, but he did like arranging things in cupboards and drawers and then opening them later and finding them just as he'd left them. "I do wish it locked," he said. "You might say thank you before you start complaining," said Gillen. "It's got a keyhole," said their mother, And I've got a whole box full of keys. Why don't you try all the smaller ones and see if any of those old keys fit? Well, much of the keys were much too big, but there was half a dozen about the right size, and all but one of these were very ordinary. The unordinary one was the most interesting key in the whole collection. Small with a complicated lock part and a fancy top. A narrow strip of red satin ribbon was looped through one of the curly openings. And Omri saved this key for the last. None of the others fit, and at last he picked up the curly-topped key and carefully put it in the keyhole in the cupboard door just below the knob. He did hope very much that it would turn, and he regretted wasting his birthday cake-cutting wish on something so silly, or rather unlikely, like that he might pass the spelling test the next day when he hadn't even looked at the words. Anyway, he closed his eyes, and he unwished the test passing, and wished instead that this little twisty key would turn Gillen's present into a secret cupboard. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door wouldn't open. "Hey, Mom, I found a key that works." So this is a quick picture of the family. So Omri's the one that's holding the box. It's a medicine cabinet. And then he's got a brother named Adiel and a brother named Gillen and his mom and dad. "You did, darling? Hey, which key worked?" His mother came to look. "Oh, that one? That's very odd. That was a key to my grandmother's jewel box, the one she got from Florence. It was made of real red leather, and it fell to bits at last, but she kept the key and she gave it to me. My grandmother was most terribly poor when she died, poor old sweetie, and kept crying because she had nothing to leave me. So in the end, I said I'd rather have this little key than all the jewels in the world. So I threaded it on that bit of ribbon. It was much longer then, and I hung it around my neck, and I told her I would always wear it and remember her. And I did for a long time, but then the ribbon broke, and I nearly lost it." "You could have got a chain for it," said Omri. She looked at him. "You're right," she said. "I should have done just that, but I didn't. And now it's your cupboard key. Please don't lose it, Omri, will you?" Omri put the cupboard on the bedside table and opened it and looked inside thoughtfully. What would he put in it? "It's supposed to be for medicine," said Gillen. "You could keep your nose drops in it." "No, that's just wasting it. Besides, I don't have any other medicines." "Why don't you pop this in?" said his mom. And she opened her hand, and it was Patrick's Indian that he had given him. "I found it when I was putting your trousers in the washing machine." Omri carefully stood the Indian on the shelf. "Are you going to shut the door?" said his mother. "Yep, and I'm going to lock it." He did this and then kissed his mother, and she turned the light out, and he lay down on his side looking at the cupboard. He felt very content. And just as he was dropping off to sleep, his eyes snapped open. He thought he had heard a little noise, but no, all was quiet, and his eyes closed again. And in the morning there was no doubt about it. The noise actually woke him. He lay perfectly still in the dawn light, staring at the cupboard, which was now, there was coming a noise inside the cupboard, the most extraordinary series of sounds, a pattering, a tapping, a scrabbling, and surely a high-pitched noise, well, almost like a tiny voice. To be truthful, Omri was petrified. Who wouldn't be? Undoubtedly, there was something alive in that cupboard, and at last he put out his hand and touched it. And he pulled very carefully, and the door was shut tight, but he pulled, and the cupboard moved just slightly, and the noise from inside instantly stopped. He lay still for a long time, wondering. Had he imagined there was a noise inside the cupboard? The noise didn't start again. At last, he cautiously turned the key and he opened the cupboard door, and the Indian was gone. Omri sat up sharply in bed and peered into the dark corners. And suddenly he saw him, but he wasn't on the shelf anymore. He was at the bottom of the cupboard. And he wasn't standing upright. He was crouched in the darkest corner, half hidden by the front of the cupboard. And he was alive. Omri knew that immediately. To begin with, though the Indian was trying to keep perfectly still as Omri had kept lying in bed a moment ago, he was breathing heavily. His bare bronze shoulders rose and fell and were shiny with sweat. The single feather sticking out of the back of his headband quivered as if the Indian were trembling. And as Omri peered closer and his breath fell on the tiny huddled figure, he saw it jump to its feet. Its minute hand made a sudden darting movement to its belt and came to rest clutching the handle of the knife smaller than a shaft of a tack. So a tack is what we put in the wall, a little tiny pin, okay? The knife is tinier than that. Neither Omri nor the Indian moved for perhaps a minute and a half. They hardly breathed either. They just stared at each other. The Indian's eyes were black and fierce and frightened. His lips were drawn back from his shining white teeth, so small you could scarcely see them except when they caught the light. He stood pressed against the inside wall of the cupboard, clutching his knife, rigid with terror but defiant. The first coherent thought that came into Omri's mind as he began to get over the shock was, I gotta call the others, meaning his parents and brother, but something He wasn't sure what stopped him. Maybe he was afraid that if he took his eyes off the Indian for even a moment, he would vanish or become plastic again, and then when the others came running, they would all laugh and accuse Omri of making things up. And who could blame anyone for not believing this unless they saw it with their own eyes? Another reason Omri didn't call anyone was that if he was not dreaming, and the Indian really had come alive, it was certainly the most marvelous thing that had ever happened to Omri in his life, and he wanted to keep it to himself at least at first. His next thought was that he must somehow get the Indian in his hand. He didn't want to frighten him any further, but he had to touch him. He simply had to. He reached his hand slowly into the cupboard. So just imagine that. You put a plastic Indian in your cupboard, or a plastic anything, and it comes alive. The Indian gave a fantastic leap into the air. His black hair flew and the fringes on his leggings fluttered. His knife raised above his head and it flashed. He gave a shout, which even though it was a tiny shout to match his body, was nevertheless loud enough to make Omri jump. But not so much as he jumped when the little knife pierced his finger deeply enough to draw a drop of blood. Omri stuck his finger in his mouth and sucked it and thought how gigantic he must look to that tiny Indian, and how fantastically brave he had been to stab him. The Indian stood there, his feet and moccasins planted apart in the white painted metal floor, his chest heaving, his knife held ready, and his black eyes quite wild, and Omri thought he was magnificent. "I won't hurt you," he said. "I only want to pick you up." The Indian opened his mouth, and a stream of words spoken in loud, tiny voice came out, not one of which Omri could understand. "Don't you speak English?" said Omri. All the Indians in movies spoke a sort of an English, and it would be terrible if this Indian couldn't. How could they talk to each other? The Indian lowered his knife just a bit. "I speak," he grunted. Omri breathed deeply in relief. "Oh, good. Listen, I don't know how it happened that you came to life, but it must be something to do with this cupboard or perhaps the key. Anyway, here you are, and I think you're great, and I don't mind that you stabbed me, only please could I pick you up, and after all, you are my Indian." He finished that in a very reasonable tone. He said all this very quickly while the Indian stared at him, and the knife point went down a little farther, but he didn't answer. "Well, can I say something?" said Omri impatiently. "I speak slowly," grunted the miniature Indian at last. "Oh," Omri thought. And then he said very slowly, "Let me pick you up." The knife came up again in an instant, and the Indian bent into a crouch. "No." "Oh, please." "You touch, I kill," the Indian growled ferociously. You might have expected Omri to laugh at this absurd threat from a tiny creature scarcely bigger than his middle finger, armed with only a pinpoint. But Omri did not laugh. He didn't even feel like laughing. His Indian, was behaving in every way like a real live Indian brave. And despite the vast difference in their sizes and strengths, Omri respected him and even, odd as it sounds, feared him at that moment. "Okay, I won't then, but there's no need to get angry. I don't want to hurt you." And then as the Indian looked baffled, he said, in what he supposed was Indian English, "Me no hurt you. You come near, I hurt you," said the Indian swiftly. Omri had been half lying in bed all this time, and now cautiously and slowly he got up. His heart was thundering in his chest. He couldn't be sure why he was being so cautious. Was it so as not to frighten the Indian, or because he was frightened himself? He wished one of his brothers could come in, or better still his father, but no one came. Standing in his bare feet, he took the cupboard by its top corners and turned it till it faced the window. He did this very carefully, but nevertheless the Indian was jolted, and having nothing to hold on to, he fell down. But he was on his feet again in a second, and he had not let go of his knife. "Sorry," said Omri. The Indian responded with a noise like a snarl. Urgh. There was no more conversation for the next few minutes, and Omri looked at the Indian in the early sunlight, and he was a splendid sight. He was just under 3 inches tall. His blue-black hair done in a braid and pressed to his head was beautiful. So his minuscule muscles of his tiny torso and the skin of his arms. His legs were covered with buckskin leggings, which had some decorations on them too small to see properly. He wore a kind of a bandolier across his chest, and his belt seemed to be made of several strands of some shiny white beads. Best of all, somehow were his moccasins. Omri found himself wondering, not for the first time recently, where his magnifying glass was. It was the only way he would ever be able to see and appreciate the intricate details of the Indian's clothes. Omri looked as closely as he dared at the Indian's face, and he expected to see paint on it, war paint, but there was none. The turkey feather had been stuck in the headband and had come out when the Indian fell and was lying on the floor of the cupboard. It was about as big as the spike on a horse chestnut, but it was a real feather. So Omri suddenly asked, Were you always this small? I'm not small. You big, the Indian shouted angrily. No, began Omri, but then he stopped. He heard his mother beginning to move about next door, and the Indian heard it too. He froze. The door of the next room opened, and Omri knew that at any moment his mother would come to wake him for school. In a flash, he had bent down and whispered, "Don't worry, I'll be back." And he closed and locked the cupboard door and jumped back into bed. "Come on, Omri, time to get up." She bent down and kissed him, paying no attention to the cupboard, and went out again, leaving the door wide open.